That's fine. I can do that. Okay, the flat Earth is, believe it or not, become a movement in the last few years. About 2015, it started up. And people may wonder, well, Danny, why are you so concerned about this? Why are you talking about flat Earth so much? Well, you see, our critics for a long time have been equating belief in creation with belief that the Earth is flat. And so I view the flat Earth movement as a personal assault, really, upon my calling and upon the ministry of Answers in Genesis. So I think it's very important, vitally important, that we're here to give people thoughtful, good reasons why the flat Earth movement is wrong and to answer questions people may have about it. And we've been getting many inquiries about this over the last few years. Well, you may say, didn't we answer this question, settle this question 5 centuries ago? I mean, after all, didn't Christopher Columbus prove that the Earth is a globe? Well, actually, we didn't settle it 5 centuries ago. We settled it 25 centuries ago. And in fact, I think that's part of the problem we have here, is the fact that people's understanding of history on this whole matter is rather poor. Well, how do we know it goes back that far? Well, Pythagoras, you may have heard of him with the Pythagorean theorem and a few other things that he did. In the late 6th century BC, he actually talked about the Earth being a sphere. We don't know what his reasons were. We can only speculate about that. But it went forward from there. But within 100 years, most Greek thinkers were thinking the Earth was a sphere. And I do credit this whole question as being a good epistemological study. I used to raise this question with my students in my astronomy classes when I taught at the university. I'd ask the students the question, what shape is the Earth? And eventually somebody would say, oh, it's a globe, it's a sphere, it's a ball. And I'd say, okay, how do you know that? And I very rarely found any students that could give me a good reason. Again, I think that's part of the problem as well. What do I mean by being a good epistemological study? Well, epistemology is defined by Merriam-Webster as a study or a theory of the nature and grounds of knowledge, especially with reference to its limits and validity. That's kind of a long-winded definition. Let me give you a much shorter definition. Epistemology is how we know what we know. And I'm afraid that much of our education is geared towards cramming into the heads of students as much information, facts and figures and dates, without really assimilating that into an understanding. And what I wanted to get across to my students at the university was not so much what to believe, but to understand why these things are true. That's the real education part, is getting people to understand the reasoning behind these things. And so we have some good reasons for believing the Earth is a globe. How do we know that? Well, here we have a photograph of a total lunar eclipse. I took this in January of last year, about 15 months ago now. And it was quite a last total solar eclipse, a lunar eclipse visible from here. And this is during totality. This is about a 12-second exposure because the moon was very dim. But I also took photographs during the partial phases before and after the eclipse. And here's one of those photographs right there. I show the moon moving in from the right, upper right, in fact, and that's exactly how the moon moved in on the Earth's shadow. And you can already see the edge of the Earth's shadow there, and you can get an idea of the shape of the Earth's shadow. It's kind of a curved section there. Now, I took this about an hour before totality. I took another one afterwards, totality, and I put it in the same right position here, and I think you can understand now a little better what kind of shape the Earth's shadow is. If you're really not seeing it at all, I can help you out and put a circle in for you. Turns out the circle of the Earth's shadow is about 2.5 times that of the circle of the moon. So the moon can be entirely engulfed inside of that shadow, giving us a total lunar eclipse. Aristotle, in 350 BC, wrote a book called On the Heavens, and he wrote that in his book that this is one of the arguments why we know the Earth is a sphere. He gave a couple others. Here's another one I like. He looked at the altitude of stars in both the northern and southern parts of the sky. I have a photograph here of the Ark Encounter. Many of you will recognize exactly where that was taken, over near Zara's Cafe, looking at the front there. This photograph was taken by a good friend of mine, Jim Bonser from Iowa, a pastor there, a good friend of the ministry. And we had special permission a couple of years ago. We went down there and spent about half a night shooting this photograph and a few others. And this is a half-hour exposure. You can see the stars are going in a big circular pattern. Near the center of that, just above the arc, you'll see one single star. That's Polaris, the North Star. And the Polaris, or the North Star, is within a degree of this point in the sky we call the North celestial pole. To the eye and even to this photograph, it's going to look like the North Star stays still and all the other stars spin around it. Now, less known is the fact that that angle that it makes with the northern horizon is equal to your latitude. So at the arc, it's around 38, 39 degrees. So that's how high that the North Star is. And as I travel around the country and around the world, I always make it a point to look at where the North Star is in the sky. If I can find it, some parts of the world you can't. Let me illustrate that for you. Let this green circle represent the Earth, and this vertical line will represent the rotation axis. The Earth spins around that rotation axis once a day. The North Pole will be at the top, and the South Pole will be at the bottom. Let this horizontal line represent the equator of the Earth. Actually, the equator is going to be a circle going around this plane intersecting the Earth there. But from the side view, it's just going to look like a line. Now let's place the observer at some position, some latitude north of the equator. This is very close to what it would be for us here in northern Kentucky, around 39 degrees latitude. You can see it's a little less than half, so that's a very good representation of where we would be. Now, if you placed an observer at the end of that line, representing some temperate location, such as ours, then the horizon would be defined by the tangent plane to the circle, assuming it's the sphere of the Earth at that point. It's going to be a tangent plane, and I'll represent that by a little dotted circle going around like that. So if you stand there at that point, everything to the upper right of that circle, that plane represented by the circle, would be visible, and nothing to the lower left would be visible. It would be below the Earth's surface and blocked at that point. Now, we can construct a little dome there to show what it looks like, and yes, the sky at night looks like a dome. It doesn't mean it is a dome, it looks like one. That's a bit of an illusion. That's why a planetarium works so well. We have a planetarium here at the Creation Museum, a new one. In fact, we've changed everything in it, so when we reopen after the COVID-19 scare is over, then you can come visit our planetarium, hopefully. We'll have new shows eventually, but it's a beautiful planetarium. I can't wait to start using it. But we can do that because it has a dome, and it does a fairly good job of representing what the sky looks like. So yes, the sky looks like a dome, but it doesn't mean that it is a dome. Now, I can draw a line for my location parallel to the rotation axis, and that's going to point to the direction in the sky around which the entire sky will seem to spin. The North Star will be located very close to that. So all the stars will spin around that point. Now, if I draw a line due north like that, there will be an angle. You can see that angle there between the point to the north celestial direction and the north direction, and that angle is equal to your latitude. If you've studied geometry, you could take this diagram and you could work that out and prove that. It's a nice little geometry problem. So if we've got some homeschoolers here taking high school geometry, that might be a good assignment. If you know something about geometry, you should be able to do that one. Now, what would happen? What would happen if I went farther north? Say up into Canada somewhere. Well, it's going to shift like that because my latitude is like that. I'll go back to Kentucky, now up to Canada, back to Kentucky, up to Canada. See what's going on? I'm shifting position as I do that. Now notice something. Notice the angle that the North Celestial Pole or the North Star will make with the horizon for me in Kentucky. Look at it farther north. The angle's much higher, isn't it? It's much higher. Again, that angle is equal to your latitude, and you can show that if you do geometry. If you go back farther south, it's a little lower. Now notice that if I look to the lower right, I can see stars down near the southern horizon, but if I go farther north, the southern horizon rises up and there are stars that I cannot see down to the south. You know, a couple of years ago, I was in the United Kingdom, and I made a trip up to Scotland while I was there and went to Edinburgh. I had a wonderful time while I was there, by the way. And it was a clear night, one night in Edinburgh, so I went outside to look for the North Star, and it was almost 2/3 the way up from the horizon. And back here in Kentucky, it's not even halfway up. You know, a few months later, I was in South Florida visiting my sister, latitude on 27, 28 degrees, and maybe 27, probably 26 even. And the North Star wasn't even 1/3 of the way up. Again, all that I see when I travel is consistent with this. It's easily explained in terms of a spherical Earth. In fact, it's required. It's a proof, as it were, because if it weren't true, it would disprove the spherical model completely. Now, if you want more proof, this is due to Pliny the Elder in the 1st century A.D. He noticed, the first person we know of who actually pointed this out, other people may have noticed it before, but that ships, as they sail away, disappear hull first. And I don't live near the ocean, so I can't test this very often, but I was at Virginia Beach a few years ago, and I took the photographs of a departing container ship. You can see the ship right here. It's got the NKY line on the side. That is NYK line. That is a major Japanese shipping firm. And you can see it's already blocked off. When I got to the beach that day and I set my telescope with the camera on it looking out over the water, this ship had already gone out some distance. And the bottom of the hull is totally blocked by something. It looks like the water to me. Now, why would it be blocked? By the way, those letters don't go to the water line. I've seen plenty of their ships close up and they stop before they get to the water line. So again, I know part of the hull is being blocked here. What's blocking the hull? Well, I believe it's the curvature of the earth. Now, flat earthers will try to claim you zoom in that you will be able to bring it back in. Folks, I've got a nearly 1,400 millimeter focal length on the telescope that I use. That is a whale of a telephoto lens. Zooming in, I've already done it. The bottom of the hull is blocked. I took a number of pictures. Here's one a little later. You can tell the ship's farther out because, well, it appears smaller. These are printed at the same scale. You can see the white bridge castle there, and it's much smaller on the second photograph than on the first photograph. And you can't see the hull at all. You can see a little bit of a what we call an inferior mirage of some of the planking down by the deck there. The later photograph, you don't even see that. The ship has turned now. All I can see is the stern, but I don't see any of the hull. I see just containers, and some of those are actually being mirrored in that inferior mirage. And then finally, as we get late in the day, you can't even see that. All you can see is the bridge castle, part of it mirrored. Again, more and more and more of the ship is disappearing. Eventually, it would have disappeared entirely. Unfortunately, it was late afternoon. Light levels were dropping fast. The sun was getting ready to set, and I had to end what I was doing. Now, building on this, a man named Eratosthenes around 200 BC accurately measured the size of the earth. When I'd point that out to my students, they were always very surprised. What do you mean? Over 2,000 years ago, they knew how large the earth was, not only just how big it was a sphere, but what the circumference and the radius were. Yes, they knew that information. How did he do it? Well, Eratosthenes was Greek. He was living in Alexandria, a city of Greek learning in northern Egypt. It was established by Alexander the Great 2,400 years ago. And he worked, Eratosthenes worked at the great library that was there at Alexandria. He traveled down to southern Egypt one year around the summer solstice. He's near this little town called Syene, which is today would be called Aswan, and it's on the edge of the tropics. And on the June solstice at noon, the sun is directly overhead. He knew this because he looked down into a very deep well, and for a few moments around noon, he could see the entire bottom of the well. That's only possible in the tropics. At my latitude, if you have a deep well, you won't see anything. It'll be in shade because the sun's never directly overhead. Well, he went back home to Alexandria, and he waited a year. He constructed a vertical pole. He knew it was vertical because they were very good builders. They could design and build things very well there. And he also knew the height of this thing. Again, they were good engineers and good architects. What he did is he waited till the next year on the same June solstice, and he looked at the shadow of this pole at noon on the June solstice. Now, it's going to cast a shadow because that far north, you're out of the equatorial regions, out of the tropics, the sun's never going to be overhead. And he determined that angle that it made, he used trigonometry to do this by knowing the height of the pole and the length of the shadow. He figured out this angle up here, and he expressed it as a fraction of a circle. It's about 1/50th of a circle. And he realized then that the distance between those two would be 1/50th of the circumference of the earth. Now, one thing I haven't told you is Eratosthenes is the father of geography. He coined the term, and he was really the world's first geographer. He had a lot of surveys done, and they mapped out Egypt pretty well, and he knew the distance between those two is like 5,000 stadia, about 500 miles by our reckoning. So what he did is he multiplied that 5,000 stadia by 50, and he got the circumference of the earth to be 250,000 stadia, or about 25,000 miles or 40,000 kilometers. Pretty impressive for 2,200 years ago. So if people knew in the ancient world that the earth was flat, I'm talking about it in the West, by the way. The Greeks knew this. They shared this information. The Romans knew it. And throughout the Middle Ages, people in the West knew that the earth was a sphere. This was not lost information. So how did this flat earth myth arise? This idea that everybody up until 500 years ago thought the earth was flat. Well, I would attribute it to three things that happened in the 19th century. Number one, archaeology as we know it came about. The way you excavate things and the way you do the science was developed in the 19th century. And prime targets were Egypt and Mesopotamia. And as they excavated in Mesopotamia, they came across this, well, I'll put it in quotes, air quotes as well, cosmology of the ancient Near East. And this cosmology of the ancient Near East was this idea that the earth was a flat disk with a dome over top. Now, y'all put this, oh, here it is. You put it up here behind the screen. Okay, I got a little visual aid for you here. I got a circle that can represent their model. Here's this flat earth. So here's the earth, and there's a dome over top of the earth is what they were saying was the model they had there in ancient Mesopotamia. And this then became the ancient Near East cosmology. Now, I put that in quotes and in air quotes because, as it turns out, a few years later, they discovered that it wasn't the cosmology of the ancient Near East. It was merely a cosmology of the ancient Near East. There are many, many others. And it was very difficult to try to correct the record. It just sort of stood out there. Also, what happened coming out of liberal scholarship was what we call the documentary hypothesis, that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, especially Genesis. Who knows? They didn't think Moses even existed. But if he did, the Pentateuch was actually written about 1,000 years or more after when Moses supposedly lived. This would have gone to the captivity or even after that. And since in captivity they were in Mesopotamia, they naturally picked up a lot of religious beliefs and cosmology and so forth from them, and they just simply incorporated those into the Bible. Now, folks who understand the authority and inspiration of Scripture should recognize very quickly this was a direct assault upon that. Now, this then developed, this is a diagram. Again, they said this is what the cosmology of the ancient Near East is. And by the way, the cosmology of the Bible, you've got this round, flat disk, and you've got the dome over top. And they didn't really get that from Scripture at all. What they got it from was the assumption that the Pentateuch is not inspired at all, but rather was simply picked up from bits and pieces in Mesopotamia. And then people began to choose to read Genesis and other passages in that manner. Also, during the 19th century, we have what's called the conflict thesis. And the conflict thesis was this, that there's always this conflict between Christianity, religion, but they meant Christianity really, and progress going on throughout the Middle Ages. And it was only when they threw all that off in the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment that supposedly things got better in the West and around the world. And of course, this fit very nicely with the narrative. It was that point when critics and skeptics began to argue, well, the Bible is a flat earth book. And unfortunately, some Christians at the time picked that up as truth and wore it as a badge of honor. That is where the flat earth movement began. Now, I mentioned in passing that even earlier in the 19th century, Washington Irving, who's an author I really like quite a bit, he in 1828 wrote a history of the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus. It was a multi-volume set, went through many, many editions throughout the 19th century, read quite a bit. And he supposedly researched it in Spain and so forth, but much of our mythology about Columbus came from Washington Irving's supposed biography. He had a way of blending fact and fiction in a way that we understand a little better today, but 200 years ago, people, when they read biography, didn't even conceive of the idea that there might be some fictional things thrown in, which he did a lot of that. For instance, the idea that his crew was about to mutiny because they thought they were going to fall off the edge of the world. That's nonsense. They were a bit concerned about being so far from land. They'd been going out for a couple of months, and at that time you never sailed more than 3 days out of sight of land. Very scary thing out there. Oh, I got a photograph here of a drawing, a depiction of the creation of day 2, you have there on the left Jesus the Creator, of course, according to Apostle John in the New Testament. And you have there the earth, and it's surrounded by this expanse, this rakia, firmament, the King James says, around the earth with waters above. That's very clearly day 2 creation. And I want you to look at the shape of the earth. Do you get the impression that it is flat? No, you get this distinct impression it is a globe, it's a ball, it's a sphere. Now, where did this depiction come from? It comes from a Bible that belonged to King John the Good of France. Now, we know how old this Bible is because I think it was in the year 1356. He was defeated by the English in the Battle of Poitiers, and this was taken by the English as part of the prize, the spoils of war, and it's been in continual possession of the English ever since. And we think the Bible was actually put together around 1350. This is 150 years or so before Columbus's voyage. So again, by 1350, people clearly were believing the earth was a globe. Common knowledge, actually, in the West. Now, ultimately, you have to ask the question, if the Bible teaches the earth is flat, then shouldn't there somewhere be in the Bible some sort of verse that says something like the earth is flat? But there is no such verse. There is no such verse that says that. Now, what flat earthers do is they take a number of passages, number of verses, and they choose to read them in a manner that's consistent with a flat earth. And then they say, aha, this is the meaning of what the scriptures say. And I'm saying, well, no, you're going to be hard-pressed to find any Bible scholars, any Hebraists, anybody who's going to agree with you on that. Sometimes they'll say, well, those are just man's ideas. Yes, but you are a man too, so why should I believe you when you know very little about these things and these other people know far, far more than you do? It doesn't really work. The complaint that they're merely men works both ways, you see, but somehow flat earthers don't seem to realize that. Again, there's nothing in Scripture that demands that the earth is flat. Merely people want to interpret it that way, and that is an example of eisegesis, reading into Scripture what you want to believe. Now, one of the arguments is that you got to read the Bible literally. In fact, people accuse us all the time. You had answers in Genesis, you creationists, you believe everything in the Bible is literal. Well, actually, we don't. That's a common misconception. For instance, we know actually, that there are many figures of speech in the Bible. We have figures of speech in English. For instance, if you wanted to translate the figure of speech, you're pulling my leg, in another language, it wouldn't make a lot of sense, would it? There are many other things like that. Then there are idioms as well, and idioms can be tricky as well, related to figures of speech. Then there are similes. Similes are things that you say when you use the word like or as. For instance, Jesus told a lot of similes. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like a sower going forth to sow seed. Or the kingdom of heaven is like a pearl of great price, or a treasure hidden in the field. He used the word is like this. This is a simile. He's not saying it is this. He's saying it's like this. But then there are metaphors. And again, there are many metaphors in Scripture. The Lord Jesus Christ in his ministry used many metaphors. He once said he was the door. He said he was the bread of life. He said he was the living water. You know, the night of the Last Supper, he told his disciples that he was the vine and they were the branches. And then he started talking about taking out something to prune them with. You know, all these cases, I don't think any of the listeners, at least the disciples following him, thought he was literally saying these things. The woman at the well, she thought Jesus was talking about literal water, and he wasn't, of course. It's very clear, but she didn't get it. But the disciples, I'm pretty certain that night, didn't think that they were branches on the literal vine that he had there. And when you come to the poetic and prophetic books, and the flat earthers rely heavily upon these, you find huge amounts of symbolism and allegorical themes coming into play. The book of Revelation, to me, is difficult to understand. I don't claim to understand it, but I am fascinated with it, as is most people. And I find numbers all over the place. The number 7 keeps popping up. In the first chapter, you got the 7 lampstands, you got the 7 stars, and fortunately for us, that's explained to us. But as you get past that, you have the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals. And then you've got 4 showing up a number of times and 24 showing up each time and 3 a few times. And what do those numbers mean? Well, I don't know. I think there's some poetry involved in that. Numbers can be poetic, as we see. But there are many, many other forms of symbolism and allegorical themes showing up in the prophetic and poetic books. Now, I do note that many of these non-literal uses are absent from historical narrative. The book of Genesis has some idioms and figures of speech, but the other devices there are largely missing. You see, the fear that some people have is, okay, if you start admitting that anything in the Bible is non-literal, then the door is wide open for reinterpreting the days of creation and the flood and so forth in some other way that doesn't mean what it says that it means. Well, that's nonsense. You see, you're confusing the two genres. It's very easy to identify the poetic and prophetic passages in Scripture. There are certain factors that they have in them. We group them together in the poetic, the 5 poetic books, and the 17 prophetic books in the Old Testament. Now, the historical narratives, the first 17 books, are very different. They do have some non-literal uses, but they're not prevalent at all. That's how we can be certain when it's talking about a straightforward thing, it's not using symbolism or allegory. You need not to be lazy in these things. You need not to be fearful. You need to rightly divide the word of truth. Now, one verse the flat earthers love is Isaiah 40:22. That's one of their favorite ones. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. They say, aha, circle. A circle is two-dimensional. It's a flat plane. It is a round thing, equidistant points from a center in a plane. Therefore, a circle, this means the earth must be a circle. Aha, the earth is flat and round, as you can see here. Well, if you want to take that definition of the word circle, your particular peculiar definition of it, and you want to impose it upon ancient Hebrew, well, that's fine. But again, that is eisegesis. What does the Hebrew word there refer to? Well, it refers to something round. Now, is a circle a two-dimensional thing? Is it round? The answer is yes. Is a sphere, a globe, a ball, is it round? And the answer is yes. So both are round. And the word here is a bit ambiguous. It can refer to something that is a two-dimensional circle. It can refer to something that is a ball. They try to argue, the flat earthers do, that it means only a circle and not anything else, and that simply is false. Now, I know many Christian scientists in the past that I've talked to, creation scientists. They have been fond of quoting Isaiah 40:22 and say, aha, this word here is best rendered as being a ball or a globe. So therefore, this is Isaiah 200 years, by the way, before Pythagoras, saying that the earth is a globe. Is that true? And I don't think it necessarily is. Again, I know some world-class Hebraists, and I've talked to them about this, and they tell me that the word is a bit ambiguous. It could mean a two-dimensional circle, like this. But it also could mean a ball. We simply don't know for sure. So to hang your cosmology on this one verse is a real dangerous thing to do, but hang it they will. They have the globe here. You can see it's flat and round with Isaiah 40:22 inscribed there. And you can see what their model is. At the center of this round disc is the North Pole. There is no South Pole because you can't get there from here. And the continents are arrayed as much as you would by looking down from the North Pole of the Earth. And it's surrounded on the edges by this ice wall they call Antarctica. Antarctica, you see, is not a continent. It's simply an impenetrable wall of ice. And somewhere beyond that, the dome comes down and rests on that thing. Okay. Some flat earthers, and I can't believe they go here, they point out the earth having 4 corners. Well, does it have 4 corners? Let's look at it. Isaiah 11:12. It says, he will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Or how about this, Revelation 7:1? After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth so that no wind might blow on the earth or against any tree. Again, the earth, Scripture says, has 4 corners. There are no corners on a globe. So therefore, the earth is not a globe. It must be flat. Case dismissed, slam dunk, we're done. As I said, I can't believe some flat earthers actually make that argument. Which is it? Is the earth round or is it square? Well, at least one flat earther in the 1890s, Orlando Ferguson, kind of split the difference. He had what I call here the roulette wheel model of the earth. It's square with angels in the corners, but then there's a round portion in there, and it's kind of, I call it the roulette wheel because it's kind of high in the middle and kind of dimpled like this, like a roulette wheel is sort of shaped. That was his model, and some flat earthers today, at least half-heartedly, talk about this one. I think most flat earthers, however, realize that the four corners talked about twice there in the scriptures, once in the Old, once in the New, are references to the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Even today, we talk about weather of the wind, for instance, coming out of the west, southwest. Well, you're relating it to four cardinal directions. That's the way most of us understand this. Okay, what about the ends of the earth? There are 28 times the phrase ends of the earth appears in the Old Testament. For instance, Psalm 67:7, it says, God shall bless us, let all the ends of the earth fear him. They say, aha, if you go to a globe, you go around and around and around that globe, you will never reach the end of that globe. So this cannot be talking about a globe earth. But if the earth is round and flat like this, there definitely is an edge. We call it the ice wall of Antarctica. Slam dunk, the earth is flat. Well, hold on a minute. Let's look at this just a little bit. I've got it underlined there. There's a parallel passage here. It says, God shall bless us, and then let all the ends of the earth fear him. Now, I ask you, if it's talking here about the ends of the earth being a physical edge, then you're talking about geography. Can geography fear God? No, it's not talking about geography. It's talking about people. It's talking about the people living at the remotest parts of the earth. Let them fear him because of the awesome God we have. Isaiah 45:22, another one. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. Again, real estate cannot be saved. Real estate cannot be saved. Only people can be saved. It's talking about people living at the remotest parts of the earth. Even today, we use this idiom, even though very few people believe the earth is flat. On a globe, we still talk about the ends of the earth because it's talking about those remotest parts of the earth. Here's another one I can't believe some flat earthers use. The tree of Daniel 4. They read Daniel 4:11. It says, the tree grew up and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. They say, aha, on a globe. If you have a giant tree grow up, no matter how tall it gets, half of the earth can't see it. It's on the other side of the earth. But if the earth is round and flat like this, then you can have a tree anywhere on the earth, and people can see this tree. Well, let's dig into this. This is not a standalone verse in chapter 4. It's actually part of an entire narrative and nicely encapsulated. The entire 4th chapter is a complete narrative of an event that happened to Daniel there in Babylon. And we can look at this. It says, the previous verse says this, the visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. This was Nebuchadnezzar talking, the king, and he was having a dream. A dream. Several points I want to make. It was a dream. I could have several verses listed there, verses 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 18, and 19. That many times it says it was a dream, it was a dream, it was a dream. I think we can be pretty certain it was a dream. I don't know about you, but my dreams are pretty surrealistic. I have dreams from time to time. Don't remember most of them, but when I do, I wake up in the morning, I thought, wow, that was weird. I'll tell you one I had many years ago. There was this big wall over here, and suddenly this giant rhinoceros came crashing through the wall and charging toward me. By the time the rhinoceros got to me, it was a dove flying around. It was a mother. My mother came towards me, and then when my mother got to me, she turned into a dove and flew off. That's typical of my dreams. So if someone wants to dream about a giant tree growing on the earth, that's actually more sane than the stuff I dream many times. Dreams are not real, folks. It's not reflecting the reality of the world. Also, I need to point out that this was a dream reported by a pagan king at that time. Also, Daniel interprets the dream, and he says the tree represented Nebuchadnezzar. Now, get this straight. It's a dream, so it's not a real tree, but within the interpretation of the dream, that non-real tree represents a person. You see the several levels removed from reality this is? It actually happened, but it's a representation. There's a lot of symbolism going on here, and it's being laid out beautifully by what Daniel's saying here. That's the factual part of all of this. The dream was real, and the interpretation was real. And by the way, the other factual part was the dream was fulfilled the 7 years that he lost his mind. It's a dream, folks. The passage is not teaching cosmology. Furthermore, it's not even clear at all that the dream with possible cosmology there even matched what Nebuchadnezzar believed. If I dreamed tonight that the earth is flat, it wouldn't mean that I believe the earth is flat. It just means I was thinking about it and I had some sort of weird dream associated with it. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here soon. If the earth is flat, then nothing can orbit the earth. So there are no satellites, and the moon doesn't orbit either. It just goes in big circles. You can't break through the glass dome, so there's nothing there. There are no satellites. There are no astronauts, and we haven't been to the moon, all right? Except I know of at least 2 Christians who walked on the moon. Actually, they came to Christ later, but Charlie Duke and Jim Irwin. Jim Irwin is now deceased. But I contacted Charlie Duke a few years ago, and I asked him, look, would you give me a quote on this? He said, sure, be happy to. He said, I was a lunar module pilot of the Apollo 16 mission to the moon. We launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on April 16, 1972. We left Earth orbit for our 3-day trip to the moon about 3 hours later. As we maneuvered our spacecraft to dock with our lunar module, the Earth came into view about 20,000 miles away. It was an awesome sight. As you can see in the photo, the Earth is obviously a sphere and not a flat circle. As we journeyed to the moon, we could look out our windows and see a smaller Earth, and each time we would see different land masses, so it was obviously rotating on its axis. Charlie Duke, Christian astronaut. Or consider Jeffrey Williams. He's more recent. He spent a lot of time in the space shuttle, took a lot of photographs of the Earth from the space shuttle, and space station, excuse me, and he had a book called The Work of His Hands. I have a copy of that book. It's marvelous photography it has, and he has many pictures of the Earth, some of them showing clearly that the Earth is a globe. No tricks here, no fisheye lens. This is actually a picture. All right.
The myth of the flat Earth. The most recent place I've seen this is an Infiniti car commercial, maybe about 2 months ago. It started off by saying, if no one ever challenged the status quo, the Earth would still be flat. And so here we have this idea that the myth of the flat Earth is this idea that the common person, the average person who lived in medieval Europe, thought the Earth was flat as opposed to a sphere. Many of us have heard the phrase that Columbus proved the world was round. In a play written in 1980 by a person called Joseph Chari, a play entitled Christopher Columbus, we find the following dialogue between Columbus and a Roman Catholic priest. Columbus says, "The earth is not flat, Father, it's round." The priest says, "Don't say that." Columbus, "It's the truth. It's not a mill pond strewn with islands, it's a sphere." Don't say that. It's blasphemy. And so here we have this idea, I can't hear it. I can't hear that the earth is round. Maybe you've heard the story that Columbus's crew, the sailors on his ship, were afraid to keep going because they were afraid they'd sail off the edge of the earth, right? And so here we have sort of depictions of that, what Columbus's crew was afraid of. And if you've heard this, don't be surprised. You might have learned it in 5th grade from this textbook, where it tells us the European sailor of 1,000 years ago believed that a ship could sail out to sea just so far before it fell off the edge of the sea. And so here we have this in a 5th grade textbook. And we have it again in an 8th grade textbook here, We the People, A History of the United States of America, tells us Columbus felt he would eventually reach the Indies in the east. Many Europeans still believed that the world was flat. Columbus, they thought, would fall off the earth. Or if you didn't get an 8th grade, perhaps you got it in college, in this textbook here. This tells us the fact that the earth is round was known to the ancient Greeks, but lost in the Middle Ages. And so if you didn't get it the first time, you might have got it the second time or the third time, but this appears in many textbooks. Even to this day, you find this. So where does this myth come from? Well, first let's say, let's ask, is this true? I keep calling this a myth, but let's ask that question. Is there any record of anyone in Europe during the Middle Ages believing in a flat earth? What do you think? No, correct. There is no record. Jeffrey Burton Russell, who is a historian of science at I think UC Santa Barbara, says, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed that the earth was flat, right? Everyone agreed at this time that the earth is a sphere. We first find this idea with Aristophanes in 250 BC. He was a librarian at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. And he estimated that the Earth's circumference is 23,000 miles. And this came very close to the true figure of 24,900 miles. This idea was recorded in the 1st century AD by Pliny the Elder and passed on through Pliny to the rest of the Western civilization. We also find this in the writing of Strabo and Ptolemy, who both lived, Strabo in the 1st century and Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. These were two distinguished Greek geographers, and they came up with an estimate of about 16,500 miles for the Earth's circumference. And this was a figure recorded by Seneca in the 1st century and then passed down to the west from Seneca. And so here we have two figures. Both of these figures assume the Earth is a sphere. One is quite larger than the other one. What was interesting is that during Columbus Day, Pliny the Elder's writings were in vogue. Everyone accepted Pliny's number, and the larger figure for the size of the Earth was generally accepted, but not by Columbus. Columbus accepted the smaller number and argued that the smaller figure was the true size of the Earth. Experts wisely urged Columbus not to set sail. They said, you're going to die in the ocean because we're pretty sure the Earth is that big. So if Columbus proved anything about the sphericity of the Earth, he proved that the medieval geographical experts were correct on the size of the Earth as opposed to his sort of minority opinion. And so that's what really happened with Columbus. Throughout Christian history, we find that the most influential thinkers of the Middle Ages and the early church all explicitly talk about the sphericity of the Earth. We have St. Clement from the 1st century, Origen from the 2nd century, Ambrose from the 4th century, and Augustine from the 4th century, St. Isidore of Seville from, I think, the 6th century, Albertus Magnus and Aquinas from around the 1100s. All of these accepted that the Earth was a globe and talked about specifically. And in other words, all the great doctors, they're called, of the Christian church considered the matter in no doubt. There was no doubt about this whatsoever. Beyond that, we have records of thousands of Christian theologians, poets, artists, etc., and also scientists taking for granted the spherical view of the Earth throughout the early medieval and modern church. In other words, all educated people in the Middle Ages, along with those who would have regularly went to church, which is pretty much everyone, were well aware that the Earth was a sphere. And this is a point made by the historian of science, Edward Grant. David Lindbergh, another historian of science, says, the truth is that the sphericity of the Earth was a central feature of theoretical dogma as it came down to the Middle Ages, so central that no amount of contrary theoretical or empirical argumentation could conceivably have dislodged it. And so not only was this a central idea, but he says it was so central that there's no way you could have got rid of it. The problem would be if someone proved the Earth was flat, that you couldn't unconvince them that the Earth was a sphere because it was so central. So where does this myth come from, this myth of the flat Earth, that Christians believed the Earth was flat throughout history until Columbus and others? Well, we first find this in Washington Irving's fictional Life of Columbus in 1828. Then this was given a massive boost by Andrew Dixon White's book, The Warfare of Science with Theology, which was published in 1896. So if you remember Andrew Dixon White from the previous slide, he was the one who really gave us this myth. He taught this myth as history. His only reference to people who believe this was Washington Irving's fictional Life of Columbus. That was his citation for this. From White, it finds its way into the Encyclopedia Britannica. I haven't checked to see if it's still there. I hope it's not. But I know it was at the writing of one of the books I'm going to talk about, which was in the late 80s or 90s, so at least was still there then. Again, James Hannam, historian of science, says, we can state categorically that a flat Earth was at no time ever an element of Christian doctrine and that no one was ever persecuted or pressurized into believing it. And so again, historians of science are unanimous that there's so much contrary evidence to this and no basis for anyone who ever thought this, that it's a completely false myth, right? Yet, anti-Christian science writers have so promoted the myth that even today, in books like The Discoverers by Daniel Boorstin, we find totally misleading accounts. And so Daniel Boorstin tells us from 300 AD through at least 1300, Christian faith and dogma suppressed the useful image of the world that had been so slowly and so painfully and so scrupulously drawn by ancient geographers. Boorstin's bias is especially sadly revealed when he castigates Christians of the quote-unquote Dark Ages for thinking that the world was flat when they didn't think this. But then he goes on to praise the erudition of Chinese geographers who actually did believe that the earth was flat at this time. And interestingly, we know that the idea of the spherical earth was introduced to Chinese geographers by Jesuit missionaries. And so it's sort of, there's a huge irony here in this, these popular books on the history of science that get it completely wrong. My favorite, though, is Umberto Eco's book, Serendipities. If you look at the back cover, you read from the editor's comments, Eco's book shows how believers in a flat earth helped Columbus accidentally discover America. And this is despite the fact that even though within the book itself, Eco actually devotes a good deal of attention to debunking this myth. So you wonder, did the editor actually read the book? Because you find this on the back cover, but it's not in the book itself. That's how pervasive this myth still is.